We've all seen the clips. Sumit Singh, a grown man, cowering before his parents, Sahna and Anil. He plays the part of the dutiful, terrified son to perfection, his face a mask of anguish and filial piety. He sold the world a story of a good son, a man trapped between the woman he loves and his unyielding devotion to his family. It's a narrative of tragic romance, of cultural conflict, of a man's heartbreaking struggle. But former friends, people who knew him long before the cameras started rolling, say that's just the latest and most profitable lie he's ever told. The story we've been fed is a carefully constructed facade, and tonight, we're going to shatter it. If you're ready to see behind the curtain and uncover the truth that's been hiding in plain sight for a decade, then make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. You are not going to want to miss a single second of this investigation, because the man you think you know is a complete stranger. To understand the magnitude of the deception, we must first revisit the myth. The myth of Sumit, the good son. This is the cornerstone of his entire public identity, the central pillar supporting his decade-long narrative on 90 Day Fiancé. It's the reason so many viewers have sympathized with him, rooted for him, and forgiven him for transgressions that would have seen any other cast member crucified by public opinion. The myth paints a picture of a man raised in a traditional conservative Indian household where the word of the parents is law. He is presented as a product of this environment, a gentle soul constitutionally incapable of defiance. His primary characteristic, according to this narrative, is his overwhelming, almost crippling sense of duty. He loves his parents so much that the thought of disappointing them causes him physical and emotional torment. He is, in essence, a prisoner of his own virtue. We see this played out in scene after agonizing scene. Remember the family interventions? The camera would zoom in on Sumit, positioned physically lower than his parents, his shoulders slumped, his eyes cast downward. He would absorb their verbal lashings, their emotional ultimatums, with a quiet, pained resignation. He rarely fought back with anger. Instead, his defense was always one of sorrowful apologies. He wasn't wrong, the performance suggested. He was just weak. He was a man pulled in two directions, his heart with Jenny, but his soul and his very identity tethered to his parents. His tears, which flowed so freely and so often, were presented as the ultimate proof of his internal conflict. They were the tears of a good son forced to make an impossible choice. He wasn't defying his parents, he was being torn apart by his love for them and his love for Jenny. This framing is crucial. It absolves him of agency. He isn't a man making a choice, he's a victim of circumstance. He's not a liar, he's just someone too scared to tell the truth. He's not a manipulator, he's just a man trying to keep everyone happy and failing miserably. This narrative was reinforced by everyone around him. Jenny, for her part, bought into it completely. Her frustration was never truly directed at Sumit's deception, but at the external force she believed was controlling him, his parents. Why can't he just stand up to them? She would lament, a question that implicitly validated the idea that he was under their thumb. His parents, in their anger, also reinforced the myth. They spoke of him as their obedient son, the one they had such high hopes for, now led astray by this older American woman. Their narrative required a before Sumit, a pure good son who existed before Jenny corrupted him. Even the show's editing and production leaned heavily on this angle, framing the conflict as a classic East meets West culture clash, with Sumit as the tragic figure caught in the middle. The audience, for the most part, accepted this. It was a simple, compelling story. It had heroes and villains, cultural stakes, and a deeply sympathetic protagonist. But what if the protagonist wasn't sympathetic at all? What if the entire foundation of this story was quicksand? According to exclusive insider reports from individuals who claim to have grown up with Sumit in Delhi, the on-screen persona is a work of fiction. We have spoken with two sources, whose identities we have protected to shield them from backlash, who paint a picture of Sumit that is not just different, but diametrically opposed to the man we see on television. Let's call them Ravi and Priya. They knew Sumit during his teenage years and early 20s, long before he ever heard of 90 Day Fiancé, and according to them, the idea of Sumit as a timid, obedient son is laughable. He was the master of the double life, Ravi tells us. From the time he was 15, Sumit understood one thing better than anyone. His parents' perception was reality. As long as they believed he was the perfect son, he could do anything he wanted. This wasn't about teenage rebellion in the Western sense, loud music, and angry confrontations. According to these sources, Sumit's rebellion was silent, strategic, and far more insidious. It was a rebellion of pure deception. Priya recalls a specific pattern of behavior. He would tell his parents he was going to a friend's house to study for an important exam. He would have the books, he would talk about the subjects, he would make his mother pack him snacks for the long night of studying. It was a complete performance. Then he would go to the friend's house, drop his books, and sneak out the back to go meet up with friends, go to a late-night cricket match, whatever he wanted. He always had an accomplice, always had a cover story. The key was he never got caught. His parents' image of him remained pristine. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was his modus operandi. Ravi describes Sumit as a brilliant social engineer within his own family. He knew exactly what his parents wanted to hear. He knew the right words of respect, the right gestures of deference. He could play the role of the dutiful son in his sleep. He would come home at the exact time he was supposed to, looking tired from studying, and thank his mother profusely for the snacks. The next morning, he'd talk about how difficult the material was. It was a 24/7 performance. The friends group, they say, was in on it. They saw the real Sumit, a charismatic, confident, and often reckless young man who was determined to live life on his own terms, but who was also smart enough to know that open defiance was a losing game. The smart play was to maintain the facade at all costs. The facade was his shield. It was his superpower. It allowed him the freedom to do as he pleased without any of the consequences. Think about the level of premeditation this requires. This isn't a kid telling a white lie about eating a cookie before dinner. This is the systematic construction of an alternate reality for the benefit of his parents. It involves long-term planning, coordination with others, and the ability to maintain a consistent persona under scrutiny. These are not the skills of a timid, fearful boy. These are the skills of a practiced manipulator. The friends allege that this extended to all areas of his life, especially his romantic relationships. Before Jenny, there were other girls his parents would never have approved of. He would manage these relationships with the same clandestine precision he applied to everything else. Secret meetings, burner phones, before burner phones were a common term. A complex web of lies that allowed him to maintain a secret romantic life while still presenting himself as the chaste, focused son preparing for a future his parents would choose for him. The Jenny situation wasn't a shock to any of us who knew him back then, Priya states. The only shock was that he finally got caught. The scale was bigger, the lie was more audacious, but the basic blueprint was the same one he'd been using since he was a teenager. Lie to your parents, present a false reality, and play the victim when the truth starts to surface. This is the bombshell. The central theory that emerges from these insider reports is that Sumit's on-screen persona isn't just an exaggeration. It's a complete fabrication. He is not a good son, struggling with a difficult choice. He is and has been since his youth a lifelong practiced manipulator who learned early on how to weaponize the perception of filial duty to get his way. Let's apply this theory to the facts we know from the show. Suddenly, everything clicks into place with a terrifying clarity. The entire Jenny saga is not his first major deception, it's just the one that became internationally televised. Think about the initial lie. He catfished Jenny, pretending to be a man named Michael Jones. We, the audience, were led to believe this was an anomaly, a misguided act of a lonely man desperate for connection. But if we accept the friend's portrayal, this wasn't an anomaly at all. It was standard operating procedure. Creating a false identity, a false reality, to get what he wants, that's Sumit's signature move. It's what he'd been doing with his parents for over a decade. He just applied the same skill set to a different target. Then came the biggest lie of all, his secret marriage. For years, he hid Jenny from his wife and his wife from Jenny. He was living not just a double life, but a triple life. The dutiful son to his parents, the husband to his wife, and the loving boyfriend to Jenny. Managing this level of compartmentalization and deceit is not the work of a weak, terrified man. It is the work of a cunning, disciplined, and morally flexible operator. The on-screen breakdowns, the tears, the protestations of being trapped. This theory reframes all of it. It's not the anguish of a man caught between two worlds. It's the panic of a manipulator whose carefully constructed realities are beginning to collide and collapse. His fear isn't of his parents' authority, it's of the exposure of his true nature. This theory also provides a chilling new lens through which to view his fear. We're told he's afraid of his parents' disapproval, of the emotional pain of being disowned. But what if the fear is far more pragmatic, far more cynical? What if his fear is purely financial? In his culture, and particularly in his family, parents often provide significant financial support well into adulthood. They provide the home, they contribute to businesses, They are the social and financial safety net. Being disowned is not just an emotional concept, it is a sentence of financial ruin. The house he lived in, the money he used, how much of it was truly his, and how much was contingent on his status as the good son. When Sumit cries and begs his parents not to abandon him, are we watching a son's heartbreak, or are we watching an employee terrified of being fired? Are we seeing a man desperate for his mother's love, or a dependent terrified of his line of credit being cut off? The theory suggests the latter. His entire lifelong performance as the good son was, in essence, an investment. It was a long-term strategy to ensure his comfort and security. Jenny was a massive, unplanned expenditure that threatened to bankrupt the entire enterprise. His panic wasn't about love or duty, it was about the impending consequences to his lifestyle. He wasn't afraid of breaking his mother's heart, he was afraid of breaking his bank account. This recontextualizes every interaction. The scene where his family and his wife's family storm the apartment he shares with Jenny is often cited as proof of the terror he lives under. We see him physically manhandled, verbally abused, and dragged away. The good son narrative frames this as a brutal display of parental control over their helpless son. But the manipulator theory offers a different interpretation. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was the violent collapse of a massive fraud. He had lied to everyone. He had lied to his parents about Jenny. He had lied to Jenny about his marriage. He had lied to his wife and her family about his fidelity and his intentions. The explosion of anger wasn't just about cultural disappointment. It was the rage of people who had been systematically deceived for years by a man they trusted. It was the fury of his in-laws, who had been made to look like fools. It was the righteous anger of his own parents, who suddenly realized the good son they had invested in was a fictional character. Sumit wasn't the victim in that room. He was the architect of the disaster, finally facing the consequences of his own elaborate web of lies. Let's examine his behavior after being exposed. A truly timid and controlled person, once their grand deception is revealed and they are forcibly returned to their parents' home, would likely capitulate. The fight would be over. But what did Sumit do? He immediately began plotting his next move. He continued to contact Jenny. He started the long, arduous process of a divorce in a country where divorce is heavily stigmatized. These are not the actions of a person who is truly terrified of their parents' authority. They are the actions of a determined individual who has been temporarily thwarted but is already recalibrating his strategy. The on-screen narrative would have you believe this is the power of love giving him newfound courage. The insider theory suggests it's not courage, it's just Sumit being Sumit. He faced a setback, his system collapsed, and now he was simply building a new system. His goal remained the same, to get what he wants. The methods just had to change. His new strategy was to pivot his performance for a new audience, the international television viewing public. He could no longer maintain the good son facade for his parents. They knew the truth. So he repackaged it for us. He leaned into the role of the tragic hero. The story he sold to Jenny and to the world was that his parents were unreasonable tyrants, and he was their helpless victim. This was a genius move. It allowed him to retain sympathy while continuing his deception. He was still lying, but he reframed the lies as necessary evils, the desperate acts of a man fighting for love against an oppressive regime. He wasn't a liar, he was a freedom fighter. Consider the endless delays and excuses he gave Jenny about the divorce and the marriage. For years, he strung her along. The divorce is complicated. My parents will have a heart attack. The astrologer said it's not a good time. From the perspective of the good son myth, these are the legitimate fears of a conflicted man. But from the perspective of the manipulator theory, they are simply stalling tactics. Each excuse bought him more time. Time to do what? Time to manage the situation. Time to placate Jenny with just enough hope to keep her in India, while simultaneously trying to manage the fallout with his family, likely trying to secure his financial position before making an irreversible break. He was playing a complex game on multiple fronts, and the excuses were his way of controlling the timeline and keeping all his pieces on the board. He wasn't scared. He was strategic. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was multitasking. This revelation completely dismantles the central pillar of his narrative. If he was never the good son to begin with, then the entire conflict with his parents is not a recent development born of his love for Jenny. Instead, it is the defining, lifelong pattern of his personality, finally brought into the light. The conflict isn't about Jenny. The conflict is about Sumit's inherent nature. He is a man who, by his very essence, creates a reality that suits his needs and presents it to others as the truth. His parents were just his first and longest-running audience. Jenny was the next, and we, the viewers, have been the largest audience of all. We have been watching a performance, a role he has been rehearsing his entire life. The dutiful son was just a character, a very convincing, very sympathetic character, but a character, nonetheless. The evidence presented by these former friends, when laid over the timeline of events we've witnessed on 90 Day Fiancé, creates a pattern that is impossible to ignore. It's a pattern of strategic deception, not fearful obedience. A pattern of calculated risk-taking, not helpless victimhood. A pattern of self-interest masked as filial piety. We have been sold a story about a man's heart being torn in two, but it seems more likely we have been watching a master puppeteer, skillfully pulling the strings of everyone around him, only to have them get tangled for the first time on a global stage. The tragedy isn't that a good son had to defy his parents. The tragedy is that so many people were hurt by a man who was never that good son in the first place. His struggle isn't about culture, it's about character. Think about his relationship with his own brother, Amit. Amit often seems to be the go-between, the voice of reason. He and his wife would come over and mediate, expressing their understanding of Sumit's position while also validating their parents' feelings. In the context of the good son myth, Amit is the supportive brother, trying to help his timid sibling navigate an impossible situation. But if we apply the manipulator theory, Amit's role becomes far more complex, and perhaps even more tragic. Amit likely grew up with the same Sumit that Ravi and Priya describe. He would have been intimately aware of his brother's double life, his schemes, and his deceptions. He would have seen firsthand how Sumit could present one face to their parents and another to the world. So when Amit is on camera, attempting to broker peace, is he dealing with the brother he knows, or the character his brother is playing for the cameras? He's trapped. He can't expose his brother's entire lifelong history of manipulation on international television, but he also can't fully endorse the fabricated narrative Sumit is selling. The result is the often conflicted, hesitant support we see. He's trying to manage an unmanageable person, a brother he knows is fundamentally not who he claims to be. He's another victim, in a way, of Sumit's lifelong performance. Furthermore, let's analyze Sumit's language and communication style with Jenny. It's a masterclass in deflection and emotional manipulation. Whenever Jenny would confront him with a hard question about their future, about the divorce, about the marriage, he would rarely give a direct answer. Instead, he would often respond with an emotional outburst. He would cry. He would talk about how much pressure he was under. He would express his love for her in grand, sweeping terms. The effect was always the same. It would short-circuit the logical conversation and pivot it to an emotional one. Jenny, who genuinely loves him, would drop her line of questioning to comfort him. Her valid concerns would be swept aside by his performance of emotional distress. This is a classic manipulation tactic. It's a way of controlling the conversation and avoiding accountability by making the other person feel guilty for upsetting you. A genuinely overwhelmed person might do this occasionally. A practiced manipulator does it systematically. It becomes their primary tool for controlling their partner. Sumit used his supposed weakness as his greatest strength. His tears were not a sign of vulnerability, they were a weapon. This theory also explains the almost inexplicable patience Jenny has had with him over the years. Many viewers have screamed at their televisions, wondering why she would put up with a decade of lies and delays. The reason is that she wasn't just in love with Sumit, she was in love with the character he was playing. She was in love with the good son, the tragic romantic hero who was sacrificing everything for her. She was a central character in his epic drama. Every obstacle, every tear, every parental outburst only served to reinforce the narrative. It made their love feel more epic, more destined. She wasn't being strung along by a liar. She was fighting a noble battle alongside a brave, tormented soul. Sumit didn't just sell this story to us. He sold it to her, day in and day out. She was his most important audience member, and her belief in the performance was essential for it to continue. To question the delays would be to question the very foundation of their tragic love story. It would be to admit that the man she moved across the world for might not be a hero, but something far more disturbing, and that is a truth too painful for most people to accept. The financial component cannot be overstated. When Sumit finally did marry Jenny, it was in secret, without his parents' knowledge. The reveal was, once again, a moment of high drama. Sahna's reaction was extreme, a complete and total rejection. She disowned him. But what happened over time? The lines of communication slowly began to open again. The relationship, while still strained, started to mend. The good son narrative would call this the slow healing process of a family, a mother's love eventually conquering her cultural objections. The manipulator theory offers a colder, more calculated explanation. Sumit knew his parents, and particularly his mother, well enough to gamble on this outcome. He knew that the public shame of a complete and permanent schism might be worse for them than the shame of accepting his marriage. He knew that ultimately they wouldn't want to lose their son forever. He pushed them to the absolute brink, absorbed the initial explosion, and then waited. He weathered the storm, knowing that on the other side, a new grudging equilibrium could be found. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it was a gamble based on a lifetime of studying his opponents, his own parents. He wasn't hoping for their love to win out. He was counting on their pragmatism and their desire to avoid a permanent public family rupture. He didn't win them over with love. He wore them down with attrition. Let's also look at the role of the astrologer. In Indian culture, consulting an astrologer for major life decisions is common and deeply respected. Sumit used this cultural touchstone to his absolute advantage. The astrologer became an unimpeachable, third-party authority that he could use to justify his delays to Jenny. It wasn't him saying they couldn't get married yet, it was the stars. How could she argue with fate? This was a brilliant move. It took the pressure off of him personally and placed it on a cosmic, uncontrollable force. It allowed him to appear as though he was eager to get married, but that his hands were tied by tradition and destiny. He was a fellow victim alongside Jenny, both of them at the mercy of the heavens. But how much of what the astrologer said was conveyed accurately? How much was framed by the questions Sumit asked? It became another tool in his arsenal, a culturally sanctioned excuse that was almost impossible for an outsider like Jenny to question or refute. He wasn't just manipulating people, he was manipulating cultural norms for his own benefit. The Sumit we see on camera is a man who appears to be constantly reacting to crises. His parents are angry, Jenny is upset, the lawyers are slow, he always seems to be on the back foot, a passive participant in his own life story. But this is perhaps the greatest illusion of all. The theory of Sumit as a lifelong manipulator suggests that he is not passive at all. He is an active and incredibly skilled agent of chaos. He creates the very crises that he then appears to be a victim of. He constructed the web of lies that ensnared his wife, Jenny, and his parents. He orchestrated the decade of delays. He managed the flow of information to all parties, ensuring no one had the full picture but him. He is not a man tossed about on the waves of a family drama. He is the one creating the storm. His performance of helplessness is the very thing that allows him to maintain control. As long as everyone sees him as the poor, overwhelmed victim, no one looks for the puppeteer's hands. No one suspects that the man in the middle of the chaos is the one who lit the first match. So, when we watch the old clips of him cowering before his parents, we are not seeing what we think we are seeing. We are not watching a terrified son. We are watching a seasoned performer who has been caught in a lie, a performance artist whose act has just been canceled. His look of terror is not fear of his mother's wrath. It's the panic of an actor whose mask has been ripped off in the middle of the stage. He is mourning not the loss of his parents' approval, but the loss of their belief in his character. Because for his entire life, that belief was the most valuable currency he had. It was his license to operate, his shield, his alibi. And in one moment, it was gone. The pattern is undeniable. The boy who faked study sessions became the man who faked being a bachelor. The teenager who managed secret girlfriends became the adult who hid one relationship from another. The young man who perfected the art of playing the dutiful son for his parents simply took the show on the road for a global audience. The conflict with his parents isn't a story of love versus tradition. It is the final explosive act in a lifetime of deception, the moment when the master manipulator finally, and publicly, loses control of his own narrative. This brings us to the most complex and in many ways the most tragic figure in this entire saga, Sumit's mother, Sahna. In the popular narrative, she is the villain. She is the domineering matriarch, the emotional blackmailer, the immovable object standing in the way of true love. Her tears, her threats, her fainting spells, they are all painted as the tools of a manipulative parent desperate to control her adult son. But if Sumit is the lifelong performer we now believe him to be, then we have to reevaluate every single thing we thought we knew about his mother. We have to consider the horrifying possibility that she is not the primary manipulator in the story. She is his first and greatest victim. For 30 years, Sahna lived with fiction. She raised a son who she believed was the embodiment of her values, respectful, obedient, and devoted. The insider reports from his childhood friends, suggests that Sumit dedicated an incredible amount of energy to maintaining this illusion. He wasn't just a son, he was an actor playing the role of her son. She invested her love, her pride, and her vision of the future into a character, a phantom crafted by the boy who lived in her house. The rage and grief we saw from her was not simply about him choosing an older foreign woman. It was the agony of a person realizing their entire reality was a lie. It was the discovery that the son she knew didn't actually exist. Imagine the depth of that betrayal. It's one thing for a child to defy you. It is another thing entirely to discover that the child you thought you knew was a stranger, a skilled deceiver who saw you not as a parent to be loved, but as an obstacle to be managed. Her dramatic reactions, which seemed so over the top on television, suddenly make a terrifying amount of sense. Her screaming, her crying, her feeling of being physically ill, this is the human body reacting to the psychic shock of a fundamental betrayal. She wasn't just losing control over his future, she was losing her own past. Every memory of her good son, every moment of pride, was instantly tainted, revealed as a scene in a play where she was the only one who didn't know the lines. Her anger wasn't just, "You're disobeying me." It was, "Who are you?" Think of the public humiliation. Sumit didn't just lie to her in private, he allowed his deception and her reaction to it to be broadcast to the world. He put his family, and specifically his mother, on a global stage to play the part of the unreasonable, traditionalist villains in his romantic tragedy. He profited, both financially and in terms of public sympathy, from her pain. He took her genuine heartbreak and sold it as content. This is a level of cruelty that goes far beyond simple defiance. It's a strategic use of her emotions for his own gain. When she threatened to take her own life, a moment that was viewed by many as the ultimate act of emotional blackmail, was it really that? Or was it the desperate, incoherent cry of a woman who felt her world had ended, broadcast for our entertainment by the very son who caused her pain? Through the lens of Sumit the manipulator, her actions are no longer those of a villain. They are the predictable, if dramatic, reactions of a victim pushed far beyond her breaking point. And what about her eventual, grudging acceptance of Jenny? The show presented this as a breakthrough, a mother's heart finally softening. The manipulator theory suggests a much sadder, more cynical reality. Sahna did not soften, she surrendered. She was a general who realized she had been outmaneuvered at every turn by a superior strategist. She knew she could not win. A permanent estrangement would mean public failure and the complete loss of her son. A grudging acceptance, however, allowed her to salvage something from the wreckage. It allowed her to maintain some semblance of a relationship, to save face within her community, and to keep a tenuous line open to the stranger who was her son. She didn't accept Jenny. She accepted that she had been defeated by Sumit. Her attempts to train Jenny on how to be a good Indian housewife were not about embracing her new daughter-in-law. They were the last desperate attempts of a woman trying to exert some small measure of control, to reclaim some tiny piece of the reality that had been stolen from her. She was trying to force the fictional world Sumit had created into some alignment with her own, a futile but deeply human gesture. This reframing of Sahna as a victim forces us to look at Jenny with new and far more critical eyes. For a decade, Jenny was the loyal partner, the woman who sacrificed everything for love, waiting patiently for her timid hero to find his courage. But this narrative requires us to believe that she was entirely blind. A naive participant in Sumit's deception. Is that plausible? For 10 years? A decade of broken promises, shifting timelines, and blatant lies. At what point does naivete become willful ignorance? At what point does the victim become a willing accomplice in their own deception? Jenny chose to believe the story because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was admitting that she had uprooted her life, alienated her own family, and spent her life savings not for a tragic hero but for a con man. The good son myth wasn't just Sumit's shield, it became Jenny's as well. It was the only explanation that allowed her to justify her own decisions. If Sumit was a weak but good-hearted man controlled by his evil parents, then her struggle was noble. Her sacrifices were for a worthy cause. But if Sumit was a cunning manipulator who had been playing her from the start, then she was simply a fool. And that is a truth almost no one is willing to face. So she helped him build the narrative. She played her part. She raged against his parents. She cried over their intransigence. She positioned herself as the hero's beloved, waiting patiently in the castle tower. Every fight she had was with the supposed source of the problem, his parents, which conveniently allowed her to avoid confronting the actual source of the problem, Sumit himself. It was a shared delusion. He needed her to believe he was a victim so he could maintain control, and she needed to believe he was a victim so she could maintain her dignity. They were co-authors of the same work of fiction. Now, look at their life after marriage. The great battle has been won. The parents have been defeated. They are finally free to live happily ever after. But they don't seem happy. They bicker constantly. The romantic hero who fought dragons for her is now the guy who won't help with the dishes. The man who moved heaven and earth to be with her now seems resentful about the possibility of moving out of his country. The cracks in the facade are showing because the performance is over, and now all that's left is the reality. The goal has been achieved. The marriage is secure. The TV checks are coming in. The need for the grand romantic performance has diminished. And what Jenny is left with is not the tragic hero, but the real Sumit. A man who is fundamentally self-interested, a man who has gotten what he wants and now seems bored with the prize. Their on-screen arguments about her wanting to return to America versus him wanting to stay in India are particularly revealing. Throughout their courtship, Sumit presented himself as a man willing to do anything for Jenny. But now that they are married, his core desires are emerging. He doesn't want to leave his home, his friends, his comfort zone. The great love story has devolved into a mundane negotiation of conflicting lifestyles. This is not the behavior of the epic romantic hero he played for a decade. This is the behavior of a man who has successfully executed a long-term plan and is now settling into the benefits. He secured the partner he wanted, on his terms, in his country. The compromise and sacrifice, it seems, were always meant to be a one-way street. Jenny is discovering that she wasn't the co-star in a romance. She was the objective in a very long campaign. Let's dig deeper into the financial web, because it may be the most crucial and most overlooked part of this entire story. For years, Jenny sent Sumit money. She believed she was helping her struggling lover, keeping him afloat as he fought for their future. The insider reports from his friends, however, suggest a much darker possibility. During a large portion of this time, Sumit was not only living a secret life with his wife, but he was also living at home, supported by his parents. So where was Jenny's money going? The good son myth would have us believe it was for divorce lawyers and administrative fees, a slow and expensive process. But the manipulator theory presents a chilling alternative. Was he using Jenny's money to finance his double life? Was her retirement savings paying for dates with his wife? Was her love subsidizing the very life he was hiding from her? This is a level of deception that is almost sociopathic in its coldness. It reframes him from a conflicted lover into a financial predator, exploiting the emotions of a lonely woman for his own enrichment. His courage to finally defy his parents seems to correlate suspiciously with his increasing financial independence. The show 90 Day Fiancé doesn't just bring fame, it brings a paycheck. As Sumit became a more established reality TV personality, he began to have his own source of income, independent of his family. Jenny also brought her Social Security income to the table. Suddenly, his parents' primary source of leverage over him, their financial support, was significantly weakened. His newfound backbone wasn't a product of love conquering all. It was a product of a cost-benefit analysis. He could now afford to be disowned. The risk had been neutralized. He didn't stand up to his parents when he was dependent on them. He stood up to them only when he had secured a new financial pipeline. His rebellion wasn't a matter of the heart. It was a matter of the wallet. It was a business decision. Let's deconstruct some of the most iconic scenes through this new, cynical lens. Remember the scene where Sumit, cornered by Jenny and his family, makes a tearful promise to his mother, Sahna, that he will not marry Jenny? He holds her. He cries. He reassures her. It was played as the ultimate moment of a son's heart-wrenching choice, choosing his mother over his lover. We, the audience, were meant to feel his pain, his impossible position. But if he is a lifelong manipulator, then this scene is transformed into something monstrous. He wasn't a conflicted son. He was a liar, pure and simple, buying himself time. He knew in that moment that he had every intention of marrying Jenny. The tears were not genuine. The promise was a calculated falsehood, designed to de-escalate the immediate crisis. He was using his mother's raw, genuine emotion as a tool. He was performing grief to placate her, telling her exactly what she needed to hear so she would back down and he could go back to planning his next move in secret. It's an act of profound emotional cruelty, weaponizing the parent-child bond for his own strategic advantage. Or consider the family therapy sessions. On the surface, this looked like a step toward healing, an attempt to find common ground. The good son narrative positions Sumit as the peacemaker, trying to get his traditional parents to understand his modern love. But from the manipulator's perspective, therapy was not a tool for resolution. It was a new stage for his performance. He wasn't there to understand his parents' pain. He was there to manage it. He was trying to find a way to get the therapist to validate his position, to act as an official third party who could help him convince his parents to give him what he wanted. He wasn't seeking healing. He was seeking leverage. He was hoping to use the language and authority of therapy to further his own agenda. When it became clear that the therapist was not going to give him an easy pass and that genuine emotional work was required, his interest waned. The tool was not effective, so he moved on. Even their honeymoon, which should have been a celebration of their hard-won victory, was filled with red flags. Their arguments about their future life together were not the typical spats of newlyweds. They were fundamental disagreements that revealed how little they had actually planned for a real life, beyond the us against the world drama. Jenny seemed surprised that Sumit had his own friends, his own social life, and his own desires that didn't revolve around her. For a decade, his entire existence, as presented to her, was about her. Now the performance was over, and the real Sumit was emerging. A man who wanted to hang out with his friends, who expected his wife to do the cooking, who was not the all-consuming romantic hero he had pretended to be. Jenny didn't marry the character in the story. She married the actor after the show was over, and she discovered that he was a very different person from the role he played. The final judgment, when all the evidence is laid bare, is damning. The story of Sumit and Jenny is not a romance. It is a masterclass in long-term manipulation. Sumit is not a tragic hero caught between two worlds. He is a cunning operator who has spent his entire life creating false realities to serve his own needs. His parents were not cruel villains. They were the first victims of a deception so profound it reshaped their entire world. His ex-wife was not just an obstacle. She was a human being who was lied to and used as a pawn in his game. And Jenny, the supposed love of his life, was not his partner, but his project. He managed her, placated her, and sold her a story for a decade, all to achieve his desired outcome. The conflict we witnessed was not about love versus culture. It was about one man's relentless, self-serving campaign and the collateral damage it caused to every single person in his life. He learned from a young age that the persona of the good son was a powerful tool, a mask that allowed him to do whatever he wanted without consequence. He simply never took the mask off. He wore it for his parents, he wore it for his wife, he wore it for Jenny, and he wore it for the world. But a mask is not a face, and a performance, no matter how long it runs, is not a life. We have been watching a ghost story, the haunting of a family by the son they never really knew. The dutiful son was just an act. The master manipulator was the real Sumit all along. Does this change how you view his decade-long struggle? Join the debate in the comments. Who is the real Sumit Singh?